We start, though, in southern Germany, where Western leaders have been doubling down on their pledges for long-term financial support to Ukraine, not just for weapons, but also in terms of rebuilding the country so damaged by Russia's war there. Addressing the Munich Security Conference, the Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, warned Ukraine had proved security was a global issue.
We are following closely the increased and stronger relationship between China and Russia. We see that they operate more together, they have exercises together, and the war in Ukraine demonstrates that security is not regional, security is global, because what happens in Europe matters for Asia, and what happens in Asia matters for Europe.
A shortage of ammunition has been top billing in Munich. And speaking to the team on NewsHour a little earlier on the World Service, Estonia's Foreign Minister Urmas Reinsalu said Europe now needed a combined response to fill that gap.
Countries will put a certain target, what kind of amount of weapons to deliver, and it should be coordinated in a manner that there is also a clear plan what kind of elements of weaponry, what are needed to get the superiority on the ground. As we in Europe made a procurement system to vaccines on coronavirus, we should also make such a joint procurement effort on ammunition, on shells from EU funds to deliver a clear systematic procurement of shells production to Ukraine.
The Munich conference is covering everything from US-China relations to the impacts of climate change and the war in Ukraine's impact on global food security. For more on what might be achieved, we spoke to Michael Wirtz, Senior Fellow at the Washington think tank, the Center for American Progress, who was among the delegates on the conference floor.
Very good question. I think the supply chain question is a serious one. Not only the European allies, but also in some parts the United States is running low on ammunition, because this war, this shooting war in Ukraine is just requiring a lot of hardware. The other issue that you mentioned, the question of public support, is much more complicated, and so often from a US perspective, when we are sitting in Washington, the war is relatively far away. There are no refugees in the United States. The energy prices as low as they always were, and the impact is obviously much more acutely felt here in Europe. So I think this conference is also important for the European partners to convey to our American delegations that the impact in terms of the exhaustion of people in Europe, the fact that there are still millions of refugees, many of whom will stay in Western Europe, that this needs to be addressed in the long term. And sometimes it's important to make sure that American officials understand the pressures under which Europe finds itself.
Yeah, because we have seen some sense, haven't we, from new senior high-ranking House Republicans in particular, that perhaps they're a bit tired of the level of money and support that the United States is being pressed into giving right now.
That is correct. There have been the first attempts on the conservative, but also on the progressive side of the caucuses in the House of Representatives to start a conversation of America needing to be looking more introspectively, looking at U.S. interests first, and not dishing out these amazing amounts of dollars that we actually spend in order to militarily support the Ukraine and guarantee this country's survival. Still, there is a political majority in both houses and also much more broadly in U.S. society. But we can expect that the conversation will pick up, especially since the confrontation or the juxtaposition or the geopolitical competition with China is dominating the public policy debate in the United States much more than it does in Europe, and Ukraine is, so to speak, of lesser interest.
Right. Well, talk to us about that then, because obviously those meetings come at a pretty interesting time. The US shooting down this spy balloon. How tense do you think that particular moment is now between those two countries?
Look, the situation is tense, but it is, as far as I can tell, also tenser than it should be. The fact that in the United States we have, I think, partially overreacted when their spy balloon was sighted and then ultimately shot down. Obviously, the Chinese are trying to get every advantage that they can from gathering intelligence in the United States. I would expect that we are doing the same in China. But the public discussion was a little surprising insofar as there seemed to be no downside whatsoever for politicians to outbid one another on who's more hawkish on China. And there's talk about a new Cold War, about looming military confrontation. All of that is not only premature, but also slightly reckless. And so hopefully the domestic political debates will not contaminate this relatively complex foreign policy challenge that we're seeing with China.
Those insecurities, as you put them, though, Michael, are driving spending, aren't they, right across NATO nations, and discussions about the level of spending that there should be on defence. Do you see those conversations happening around you already at the conference?
These conversations happen, and they have happened over many years in the past, but I feel that these discussions are fading a little bit because the war in Ukraine has shown that it is not about the volume of money that you invest in military assets alone, but about mobility, communications, highly mobile assets on the ground. So I feel, which is a good thing, that the conversation has progressed to what you actually need to fight modern wars or to provide deterrence to save Western countries from further incursions by the Russian regime, and a little less about the fiscal dimensions of who has to pay how many percentage points compared to GDP into the NATO pot.
Our thanks to Michael Wirtz from the Centre for American Progress there. Well, let's take a look at the markets now with Chris Lowe, Chief Economist at FHM Financial in New York. Chris, thanks for ending your week with us as always. Great to have you back.
Yeah, good to be here.
Funny end to the week, though, wasn't it? The Dow and the S&P both posting losses.
Well, losses, but clawing back from the lows of the day. It was a tough week, I think, for stock market investors because coming into the week, we had sort of a cloudy economic picture in the U.S. Over the course of the week, we saw blockbuster retail sales, higher than expected inflation. And we heard from quite a few Fed officials, including some today, raising the prospect of higher interest rates.
Yeah, we touched on this on last night's programme with Kerry Leahy, Chris, but just explain why that might be, because it was all to do with sort of producers' prices again, wasn't it?
That's right. And producer prices tend to change direction before consumer prices. So they have been very well behaved for the past year. We've seen producer inflation slowing, which is a good sign. But the latest PPI report went the other direction, producer prices spiking higher. And while it was energy, which was very much expected, there was also some pressure on non-energy goods prices. That was a surprise. And it has people wondering if perhaps demand is so strong, in fact, that producers are again struggling to keep up. We heard from Mickey Bowman, who is a voting governor at the Fed, and her take on the whole thing is that while the data perhaps are a bit uncertain, the one thing she does know is inflation is still much too high. She believes the Fed has to tighten quite a bit more to bring that under control.
Yeah, and all against this backdrop, even though we've had a lot of headline figures, haven't we, about big technology firms laying people off, but still a pretty tight labour market too in the US.
Very tight. And it is, in fact, small businesses now that are doing most of the hiring. Well, as you say, we've had high-profile layoffs from all of the big tech companies. But even there, if you look closer, what you see, for example, Amazon's layoffs, while they were large, fewer people lost jobs than the company hired in the 4 months prior. So as a percentage of the total workforce, it's still pretty small.
Yeah. One to watch, and certainly what the Fed does next, one to watch that we will be doing on this programme. Chris Lowe, have a great weekend. Great to have you with us as always. Let's head back to Europe now, though, but sticking with some of those firms that Chris was talking about, because when the clock strikes midnight here in Europe tonight, no, big tech firms won't turn into pumpkins. They will, though, have to reveal data they normally keep pretty close to their chests, precisely how many users they have on their platforms. That's because when legislation known as the Digital Services Act, or DSA, comes into force across EU nations, the likes of TikTok, Meta and Google will face some of the strictest rules in the world about how they look after our data anywhere on the planet. In fact, firms with over 45 million users in the European Union, which includes all of those, will have to pay fines of up to 6% of their massive global revenues should they be found to breach the new rules. For more on what else the bill aims to achieve, we spoke to Asha Allen from the Centre for Democracy and Technology Europe, based in Brussels.
For us here at the Centre of Democracy and Technology Europe office, but for many of us in civil society, today has been a long-awaited day as we've followed and advocated to improve the DSA from its inception. And the deadline today for platforms and search engines to declare their average monthly users in the European Union was quite significant, because this was really the first in a set of crucial steps in bringing the DSA to life. Now, this is important because the Digital Services Act adopts a tiered approach in terms of how its provisions, most notably novel due diligence obligations, will actually apply.
Right,
so in short,
and that's because it's to do with the size of the companies, right?
Precisely that. So in short, the larger the platform or search engine you are, the more obligations from the DSA that apply.
Just take people back a step, Asha. Remind people why this legislation has been brought forward by the Commission and what it's meant to achieve.
Absolutely. For an organisation like ours that, works to promote human rights in EU tech policy and law, the DSA has been a high priority for many of us. It's been touted as the new constitution for the internet, and it will absolutely no doubt bring some much needed regulation to the digital world, and with the Brussels effect potentially in full swing, will prove to be influential globally.
The Brussels effect, really interesting concept, talked about a lot in your kind of circles, but just for people who perhaps haven't heard it before, that basically is where what Brussels does, because there's so many countries, big countries, important countries involved in the European Union, and actually where Brussels goes, people tend to follow in terms of these regulations. So we might see something spill over into Asia or the UK or the United States as a result of what's been done today.
You're absolutely right. And what that term actually just captures is that kind of soft power of the European Union and in being at the forefront of setting regulation that's very likely to have an impact, whether that's in other jurisdictions. So we're already seeing other countries look to the DSA as a model for what they may do when it comes to regulating the online space. And there are many countries thinking about this at this moment in time.
What would it let the European Union do, Asha?
So it's very interesting. The Digital Services Act is an extremely large regulation, and it does set in stone some very strong mandatory due diligence obligations, not only obligations to tackle illegal content and its dissemination online. So any kind of violation of these principles or provisions of the Digital Services Act will result in national regulators, but also uniquely in this situation, the European Commission, in regards to very large online platforms and search engines, being able to apply punitive measures after extensive investigations and being able to encourage a better due diligence from the platforms that we engage with.
Does it have any potential unintended consequences, Asha, in that if you are smaller to go underneath the cap in terms of the number of people that have to be using your platform to meet some of these regulations, that perhaps there's an opportunity for you to push some of the boundaries and some of the limits here and gain a bit of market share?
The Digital Services Act does include obligations that apply to all platforms, regardless of size. So that does include transparency obligations and some of the respect for some of those due diligence obligations. And now it's interesting that you mention about some of the platforms under that threshold. As we have been seeing declarations come in today, some platforms haven't necessarily declared their precise number of average users. So it will be interesting to see what this means moving forward. This may very much be a case for those respective platforms or search engines that they don't reach the threshold, which is actually 45 million average monthly users. But it is setting somewhat of an oppositional tone towards increased transparency and public scrutiny. The good news, however, is that the Digital Services Act is aimed to be an adaptive regulation. So if there are changes that need to be made later on and amendments and additional safeguards that need to be provided, then there are still opportunities to do so.
As Asha Allen mentioned, not all those figures and that data in yet. We will have it all by Business Matters, though, so do join us at 1 o'clock GMT here on the BBC World Service. We're going to move from European tech, though, to Chinese tech now, and a worrying norm, unfortunately, in China, where another senior businessman has gone missing as President Xi Jinping continues his anti-corruption campaign. Bao Fan is one of the country's top investors and has funded major tech projects right across China. His company, the private investment bank China Renaissance, says it hasn't been able to contact him for some days. Our correspondent in Beijing, Stephen McDonald, told us there's no official statements yet to explain Mr. Bao's whereabouts.
We don't know, beyond that short announcement from his company, what's happened to him. But it looks like his disappearance is part of a pattern whereby these senior executives are taken away and questioned by the Communist Party's Discipline Inspection Commission as part of the anti-graft crackdown here. And sometimes they re-emerge and have to change their ways or alter the way the company does things, or they could find themselves facing more serious charges. But the announcement that he disappeared sent shares in his company tumbling. Of course, that is because the first thing investors would have thought is it's got to be because he's being investigated personally for corruption. But it might not be that. It could be that he's being questioned in relation to other people's corruption, other companies and what they've done, because he's been at the heart of all these tech sector deals. He's put together these huge mergers of tech companies here. He would be able to tell investigators an awful lot about everyone in the top tier of China's tech sector. Now, that said, there was another executive from his company taken away in September last year for questioning, so perhaps it is something to do with China Renaissance. Who knows? But it looks like his disappearance is in some way bound up in this anti-corruption crackdown.
Manchester United, one of global football's biggest brands, is up for sale and now it seems subject to a bidding war. More on those bids and the latest on that in a moment, but first we wanted to gauge the mood with some fans about what they were hoping from their new owner.
Well, the Qataris would be, they've got the money, but it's the other things that go with it that wouldn't sit right with me.
Jim Ratcliffe.
Local lad, local billionaire.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Anyone but the Glazers.
Anyone but the Glazers. Yeah. Elon Musk.
I'd have
Jim Ratcliffe.
I don't know about Jim Ratcliffe.
I'd like to see redevelopments on the stadium, because it is rotten. Like, there are leaks in the stadium and stuff like that, and also like paying off the debt and stuff like that. As long as they support Man United, they actually want to build a good project, I'm happy with it.
I feel like the club's been neglected by the Glazers for a long time now, so I feel definitely new owners, whoever they may be. No, I have no preference. I wouldn't mind Elon Musk, to be honest.
Fans outside Old Trafford there. Well, in the past hour, it's been revealed one of Qatar's top bankers, Sheikh Jassim bin Hamad Al Thani, confirmed his foundation's bid to buy Manchester United before the Friday deadline. We already knew that the British petrochemicals billionaire and lifelong United fan Sir Jim Ratcliffe had also bid to buy the club from the current owners, the Glazer family, who you heard mentioned there. The BBC's Andy Swiss has more.
We've had a bid from Sheikh Jassim bin Hamad Al Thani. He's the chairman of a Qatari bank. He's the son of a former Prime Minister of Qatar, and he says he is a lifelong Manchester United fan. In a statement, he says his bid will return the club to its former glories, both on and off the pitch. He says his bid is for 100% of the club and will be completely debt-free through his foundation. Remember, the current owners, the Glazer family, angered a lot of the fans here by plunging the club into millions of pounds of debt. And he says his vision is for Manchester United to be regarded as the greatest football club in the world, although he doesn't give any size or amount of his bid. Now, one potential stumbling block is that a Qatari consortium already owns another major European club in Paris Saint-Germain, but we understand that this consortium regards itself as entirely separate, so they don't believe there would be any conflict of interest. Now, Qatar, of course, has just hosted the World Cup, although many fans here will be concerned about the country's human rights record. We are expecting other bids to emerge. The British billionaire Sir Jim Ratcliffe has already expressed an interest, and it is still the early stages.
Well, for more on the backdrop, here's the football finance expert, Kieran Maguire.
Manchester United claim to have 1.1 billion fans around the world, and yet if you take a look at their revenues, it works out as just over £500 million. So they're effectively getting 50 pence per fan per year. You've only got to double that. If you can make it £1 per fan per year, then all of a sudden Manchester United becomes £1 billion a year business. So long as you keep control of costs, and by costs we really mean player wages, then Manchester United goes from a business which is broadly breaking even into one which is making spectacular profits and large returns for investors. We've seen Manchester United's share price more than double over the course of the few months since the Glazers made the announcement. So presently the shares are valued at around about £3.8 billion. You add on the debt, so we're probably coming to around about 4.5. You need to persuade people to sell. So I think the asking price, as far as the Glazers are concerned, is somewhere towards 7 or 8 billion. But I think the offers are more likely to be in the region of 5 or just over 5. Football is a talent industry. The talent follows the money. And in order to have the money, you need rich owners who are prepared to effectively to subsidise it from a business point of view.
Finally, here on World Business Report, Helsinki has become one of the mobile gaming capitals of the world. But just how did it do it? The BBC's Stefan Powell has been taking a look.
It's interesting. Firstly, you don't expect it of somewhere like Helsinki when you think of innovative tech locations around the world. Well, you're thinking of Singapore, you're thinking of Tokyo, Silicon Valley. But in this city, a company called Rovio, Netflix, set up shop last year. Its first ever internal game studio, because Netflix is getting into gaming. Where did they set up? In Helsinki, because they said it has some of the best games talent in the world. Supercell, the maker of Clash of Clans, the base building game that you've probably seen an advert for at some point.
Yeah!
No, barbarians.
You and this army. Clash of Clans. Download for free.
Has just been, recently valued at $11 billion and been bought out by the Chinese company Tencent. There are 200 games companies there worth $2.8 billion to the Finnish economy.
Right, so that's sort of a bit of how we got there, I suppose. How, from the flicking of the Angry Bird that you mentioned, has it managed to stay in that position, though? Because most people will know that they were playing some Angry Birds quite a while ago, sat on their train. So how's it stayed on top?
Well, it's quite a while ago that sort of those foundations that were set in stone, and they're reaping those rewards even now. So essentially you had, Finland wasn't an especially wealthy country in the 80s and 90s, so the technology people were using there wasn't necessarily always the most up to date. And so that created a scene where programmers were pushing those computers to the most of their capabilities, and it led to a scene called the demo scene there, where people would make art presentations, music, games, and using this old tech and pushing it to the most of its ability. Then Nokia came along, and of course mobile technology is all about doing a lot with a little, and so they had these young companies doing that, and then a big mobile phone manufacturer from the same place, and that created a sort of a perfect blend in the 80s and 90s that really set them on this path. Since then, the government have obviously looked and thought, hang about, I can see something working here. And so there's been a lot of government intervention and government programs to support people and allow them to try and set up new companies. And that's exactly what Sarita Runberg, who was head of gaming at the infrastructure company Reactor, who helped games companies set up in Helsinki. That's exactly what she was explaining to me while I was there.
I think we're just generally very interested in technology. We have this ability and it's in the culture that we can try and then we can fail and then we try again. You don't have to worry about failing. And when you don't have to worry about failing, you're obviously much braver. We have the social security network, so you don't actually have to mortgage your own house if you want to start a company. And then also the government is supporting gaming companies a lot.
That's really interesting thought, Steph, isn't it? Like the conditions there, is that the type of things that have allowed Finland to kind of keep developing and keep building on those initial successes?
Yeah, so you've got this sort of the government trying to help fund some of that success. And also they're chasing the best games talent in the world. 30% of the developers that work in Helsinki are from abroad. It's not because of the climate, as people there were saying to me, to be fair. They're targeting the best talent in the world and going after them. And in fact, there is an organisation called Helsinki Partners, and part of their job is to do just that. And Johanna Hure is from Helsinki Partners.
Helsinki is known for its work-life balance. We don't have those money incentives for many things, but actually you get more here. Because yes, we have maybe less salaries than in Silicon Valley, but you don't have to pay for the schools, so you don't have to pay for the health insurance, and everything like that is covered. So actually you have more money in your pocket.
Now what's interesting listening to that for me, Will, is that I assumed going to Helsinki that there would be tax incentives or higher salaries that would be used to draw the best talent in. But it's not about that, actually. What they're saying is you still got to pay a tax. Your salaries aren't necessarily higher than Silicon Valley, but what we give you is a nice life, you know? And that is actually a big selling point for people to
just
get
a
there.
great environment. I mean, how much of that is transferable, Steph? Because a lot of people listening around the world will hear a lot of these things, and often it's Scandinavian countries, aren't they, are at the top of a lot of these indexes and things. But how much of it do you think is replicable? How much do you think can be learned by other places who want to copy this success?
Well, I think every city and every country in the world has got its own unique selling point. So, you know, in Finland, obviously, you can't recreate that heritage of technology. But is it interesting to hear about this blend of public investment and private companies and the relationship between them? And that is a slightly different approach to perhaps you see in more countries that follow more free market economics and free market thinking in other parts of the world. So this is a slightly different approach because you think, well, this is a mobile gaming, especially it's a $120 billion economy at the moment and only growing.
And you can check out more of Stefan Powell's reporting online, bbc.com/business, or do check out Steph's excellent podcast, Press X, to continue. That's just about it from us on World Business Report for the week. Remember, our podcast always available. Just search for it daily. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you Monday.
Lives Less Ordinary is the podcast that brings you extraordinary personal stories from around the world. Each week, we invite listeners inside the most intimate and defining moments of our guests' lives.